Hi diddly ho, neighborinos. This is the recap video for my series on Jewish history at the end of the 19th century, where I talk about things I left out of the videos, correct mistakes that I made in the videos, and answer questions from Gaon and Navi level patrons on Patreon. If you are a long-time viewer of this channel, you will have noticed that I've switched from releasing a video every 2 weeks to every 3. This is because each video I release requires, on average, about 120 hours to make, from research all the way up to uploading and formatting. That's 3 weeks of full-time work, and I was doing that every 2 weeks. I was unable to function as a person, and I had to switch to 3 weeks so I wouldn't die. And this is going to be a lot better for the channel than the long breaks I was taking between runs before, because I won't be punished for the algorithm for going away for a while. Hopefully. Anyway, let's get into this, because there's a lot to talk about. First up, 2 small corrections. Kattowitz, modern Kattowitz, is now in Poland, but at this time was part of the German Empire. I mistakenly said it was in Austria. Additionally, I've been told that Zichron Yaakov was originally called Zamarin, not Shomron. This is a weird case because, in a sense, both names are correct. Zamarin was the name of the Arab village from which land was purchased to build the initial settlement, and it appears that the 2 habitations were simply referred to as one place, Zamarin. However, it was assumed at the time that the name Zamarin derived from Shomron, Samaria. And while the village of Samaria still existed up in the mountains, the land which included Zamarin was part of the historic region of Samaria. So a lot of early press referred to the village as Shomron. This is kind of splitting hairs though, because the name was changed to Zichron Yaakov less than a year after its founding, so there's probably no way of knowing which name was official. So I've said before that usually I write much longer first drafts of my scripts, which tend to get pared down more and more throughout the whole process until they're 2 to 4 minutes shorter. Usually, this is because I find that I've included statements that are redundant, or don't add anything, or just don't relate enough to the core subject of the video to warrant inclusion, but could be revisited in later episodes. In this episode, I found a 4th option, which is something that was kind of relevant and interesting and consequential, but wasn't quite enough of any of those things to warrant inclusion in a script where there was just no natural place for it. And that's the Subbotniks. Subbotniks originated in the 18th century as a group of Christians who broke away from the Russian Orthodox Church, and were basically the closest thing Russia ever had to a homegrown Protestant movement. About half of the movement, who mainly lived in Armenia for some reason, were Judaizers, which means they started practicing Jewish law as part of their Christian beliefs, such as observing the Sabbath on Saturday, hence Subbotniks. When Emperor Nikolai I began to crack down on the Subbotniks as part of Russification, the Judaizing faction basically said, to hell with it, converted to Judaism, and in the 1880s, most of them emigrated to Palestine. However, they were viewed with skepticism by other Jews, as most religious Jews didn't consider their conversions to be legally valid, and most Zionists weren't religious in the first place. So in 1904, the Subbotniks nominated a rabbi from Lithuania named Avraham Yitzchak Kook to take the position of Rabbi of Jaffa. Kook accepted and worked to welcome the Subbotniks into the normative Jewish community, at which time they assimilated out of existence. And I'm sure we'll be hearing about Rav Kook in due time. Something else that happened in Palestine during this period, really throughout the entire 19th century, was a large, well, not large, but certainly impactful wave of non-Jewish immigration. Obviously, in my video on the Damascus affair, I talked about the breakaway Egyptian government deliberately settling loyal Bedouin groups in Palestine, but there were many more groups coming in for all sorts of reasons. There were some Arabs fleeing the French invasion of Algeria in 1830, for which it can be said that shakshuka, the classic Israeli full breakfast, was introduced by both Jewish and Arab immigrants. There were also quite a few Circassians fleeing persecution in southern Russia, as well as Bosnians fleeing the Austrian occupation in 1878. And perhaps most famously, at least among the type of people who would watch this recap video, would be the Baha'i. Of course, the Baha'u'llah, who was the founder of Baha'i, took refuge in the city of Acre, and Haifa has become the central holy place of the Baha'i, much as Jerusalem is to Jews or Mecca is to Muslims. The permanent Baha'i community in Israel is very small and not likely to grow for a variety of reasons specific to Baha'i belief and administration, but it is certainly visible. Again, two minor corrections. First, in my layout of French political parties in 1898, I accidentally used the photo of Georgy Plekhanov instead of Jules Gèsde, which I guess shows what else I was working on when I was making this. I was also pretty delirious with COVID during the whole Dreyfus affair production process, so a lot of the issues there may stem from that. To that point, Georges Méliès' film L'Affaire Dreyfus was only 11 minutes long, not 3.5 hours. This should have been obvious, but again, delirious. And as someone who went to film school and was one of the last students at my university ever to work with real film, and who also grew up before digital projection when movies were stored on actual 35mm film canisters, my brain just read that the film comprised 11 reels and defaulted to, oh, a reel is 20 minutes of finished film, therefore it was 3.5 hours long. Anyway, the Dreyfus affair was such an all-encompassing event that it included a whole lot more people than I could have ever included in the video, including some major players. Easily the most important figure in the framing of Dreyfus that I left out was Major Armand Dupaty-Duclaume, who worked closely with Henri through all of that, and he was forced to resign from the army, but came back for World War I, where he was killed. He was the guy who convinced Bertillon to sign on to the idea that lack of evidence is evidence. The core Dreyfusard team, meanwhile, actually had 12 members, not just the 7 that I included in the video. Of those I left out were former Justice Minister Ludovic Traria, founder of the Human Rights League, which still exists today, the economist Yves Guillot, the anarchist writer Bernard Lazare, who during this same period was also a delegate to the First Zionist Congress, interestingly enough, Fernand Laborie, who was literally just Dreyfus's lawyer, and Francis de Pressensé, who was a former diplomat and then in 1902 was elected to the Assembly as the socialist member for the Rhone. Another minor correction, which is very out of character. In this map of cities, I misplaced Vienna on, I think, the Drava instead of the Danube. Again, brain fog. Now, something that I think is unfortunate is that the traditional English translation for Der Judenstaat is misleading because Der Judenstaat doesn't actually mean the Jewish state. The Jewish state in German would be Der Jüdische Staat, whereas Der Judenstaat means the Jews' state. For comparison, the Hebrew translation gets it right as Medinat Yehudim, whereas Jewish state would be a Medina Yehudit. And I don't think this is a small thing because it pretty well encapsulates the ideological battle between Herzl and HaAm. In fact, when HaAm was criticizing Der Judenstaat, his talk of not a state of Jews but a really Jewish state was a play on the title. And because of that bad translation, the context gets lost in English, which is annoying, but it leads nicely into the first question. Gaon-level patron Learnabit asks, what remains today of the conflicts between the early Zionist visions of HaAm and Herzl and Max Nordau? So when it comes to the issue of culture, by the end of this episode, HaAm had firmly won that battle. To look at modern Israel today, the music and the food and the architecture, it is much more Levantine than European, and certainly Hebrew prevailed very conclusively. And as we'll see in the next year or so of videos, even the idea of an independent Jewish state really went away for a long time. I'm tempted to say that Herzlian political Zionism did begin to make a comeback in the 1920s, because the idea of independence did come back in some corners relatively quickly. But at the same time, that was no longer bound up in the question of culture. And I can't really say that the conflict between Herzl and HaAm persists today because HaAm wasn't permanently opposed to a Jewish state. He just believed that was something that would happen eventually, and that to set that as the main goal was missing the point. So Herzl, as I said, was someone who wasn't very popular with other Zionists. His main asset was his natural charisma and his ability to get everyone in the same room and generate buzz, but his actual vision for Zionism was something most other Zionists didn't agree with, and they also didn't agree with a lot of his tactics for advancing the Zionist cause. In the next video, we're going to deal with probably his most famous defeat, and indeed his last. But in terms of a moral event horizon, his biggest controversy arguably came much earlier. This is something that wasn't even on my radar when I did research for the video, but people were very upset about it, and rightfully so. At the same time Herzl was rising to prominence, Sultan Abdul Hamid was overseeing a genocide against Armenians. It's not the Armenian genocide, but it was very much a precursor to that. And in addition to between 80 and 300,000 dead, there were also forced conversions, the forced assimilation of orphans, and this was an international outrage. There were many Western governments that were absolutely ready to just invade and occupy the whole of Anatolia. So when Herzl began interceding with the Sultan at the tail end of those massacres, Abdul Hamid expressed a willingness to throw Herzl a bone in exchange for Herzl using his influence to downplay the massacres, which Herzl was amazingly fine with. And I say that because not only was he outnumbered by his fellow Zionists in this proposal, he was fully alone, and he received no shortage of public condemnation, even by those who were very close to him. In fact, when he first proposed this to Nordau via telegraph, Nordau just sent the one-word reply, "No." Something that a lot of people brought up in the comments was that there are in fact organizations and individuals that claim to be Bundists today, and as a result, they took issue with my claim that Bundism effectively died out in the 1950s. My response to that would be, what would you define as Bundist, and do they actually constitute a meaningful political force? So the main source I used for this video was a paper called Arkady Kramer, Vladimir Medem, and the Ideology of the Jewish Bund, which was much more illuminating than I expected because it was written in July 1945, so after VE Day, but before the end of World War II. And the author characterizes the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as essentially the last moment of relevance for the Bund in Europe. But he also notes that the Bund is now, in 1945, establishing itself in the United States. And to wit, my mother, who was born in 1953, did attend Kinderschule, which was basically Bundist preschool in East LA. Don't worry, she was also Hashomer Hatzair. But I don't think anyone would argue, there were never any Bundist elected officials in 1950s America or later. I would also say the same of Australia, which arguably does have the most significant lingering Bundist influence. Likewise, there was a woman recently who ran for the Vienna City Council as a Bundist, but she didn't win. Now, obviously the Bund at this early period didn't hold any public offices either, but they would, and in more countries than you might expect. So I'm still comfortable saying Bundism is functionally dead and has been since at least the 1950s. A lot of people in the comments also took issue with my characterization of Lenin and Martov as accelerationists, indicating instead that their disagreement with the Bund was rooted in the feeling that the Bund was operating only as a force for economic revolution and not political revolution. Looking back at my sources, I can see that now, but in fairness, I really struggled to understand it because, to be honest, that criticism doesn't really strike me as fair. I don't see any evidence that the Bund wasn't concerned with political restructuring, and the very fact of them being a Jewish autonomous party is pretty good evidence that they were. To my eyes, they were just doing what they could at the time, which was organize workers, because Russia was an absolute monarchy. There was no political process. So if the Bund was guilty of being apolitical because of that, then so were Lenin and Martov. if there's something I'm missing here, please tell me. Because in the context of that time and place, I don't see the same meaningful difference that they did. Navi-level patron Jacob Korsoff asks, what were Lenin's views of Jews? This is something that will come up in a future video. However, that's going to be a very long time from now. Possibly even a full year from now, so I'm gonna talk about it now, because it's actually pretty interesting. I would describe Lenin's attitude towards Jews as what we in more recent history might call colorblind, or perhaps post-racial. Some older Americans who remember the politics of the 1970s through the 90s might look to Jack Kemp as a comparison, which is to say he wasn't particularly sympathetic to Jewish causes, but he was very critical of overt anti-Semitism. Though he targeted synagogues in the name of opposition to religion generally, he blamed anti-Semitism on capitalist propaganda, and he condemned Bolshevik allies who committed atrocities against the Jewish community during the Civil War. Russian Civil War, there were many different sides, and virtually all of them targeted Jewish communities at some point, but when the Reds did it, Lenin was very quick to call them out. With that said, Lenin became absolutely opposed to the Bund during the Second Congress of the RSDLP in London. He saw them as an overcorrection and ethnocentric, and that's something we're actually going to revisit in the next episode. Something Lenin himself never knew was that his maternal grandfather was a Jewish-born man who'd converted to Christianity, and once this was discovered, it was suppressed by Stalin for fear that it would undermine his revival of Russification. Gaon-level patron Matthew Brotman asks, you made a couple of passing references to the Alliance Israélite Universelle. Who were they, and what did they do? This is something I thought I'd covered pretty well in bits and pieces over the course of the 19th century, but perhaps it needs to be put together in one place. The Alliance Israélite Universelle was a Jewish aid organization based in France. It was formed in response to the Mortar affair in Italy in 1858, though I would argue that the seeds for it were planted in the Damascus affair back in 1840. Essentially, it was a philanthropic trust which sought to give assistance to Jewish minorities living in countries where they were under threat. And the most famous way they did this was through legal aid, and at times they even played a kind of diplomatic role. And they were most active in the Muslim world. The agricultural school near Tel Aviv was established by the Alliance in order to train Jewish refugees to become farmers so they could become productive members of society in Ottoman Palestine. There are also a lot of things that were named after the Alliance, but which they themselves didn't actually do, such as the Alliance Colony, which was essentially an attempt to create a moshav in rural New Jersey. The main thing they actually did, though, was establish schools. So Eliezer Ben Yehuda taught Hebrew at their school in Jerusalem. They also had schools in North Africa, and in addition to Jewish education, and the standard reading, writing, math, the liberal arts, they also taught French. So in addition to being a mission for Judaism, they were also a mission for French education and French culture. I say were, they are. They're still around. So some people asked whether I would make a video about Esperanto. Most of you, I assume, are aware of Esperanto as an early attempt to create an international auxiliary language. What you may not know is that its creator, Ludwig Laser Zamenhof, was a Jewish man from the Russian Empire, who was only a year younger than Eliezer Ben Yehuda. He grew up not far from where Ben Yehuda did, and he was developing Esperanto at the same time Ben Yehuda was working on Hebrew. His Hebrew name was even Eliezer Ben Mordechai. However, I have to make decisions about what is or isn't worth making the subject of a video. To what extent was the creation of Esperanto inspired by Zamenhof's Jewish background? I don't know. Are there academics who have tried to answer that question? Probably. But would that make a compelling video in its own right? I have my doubts. Papiamento might get a mention down the line. Navi-level patron Osher Gordon asks, is there a connection between the anti-Hebrew extremists and the radical wings of the ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionist political parties in Israel today? It depends on which party. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Certainly there are some Hasidic groups, even in modern Israel, who disapprove of the use of Hebrew, and their preferred party is Agudat Yisrael, which today is a faction within United Torah Judaism, which is still officially an anti-Zionist party. This is definitely not the case with Shas, being the party of Sephardic ultra-Orthodoxy, which never developed the same cultural hang-ups. The devolution of religious Zionism is an interesting one, because, as I said in the Herzl video, the original religious Zionists were masculine. Their ideological descent is closer to that of Reform Judaism than of ultra-Orthodoxy. The very fact of them being a Zionist group attests to that, and under Rabbi Reines and his successors, the religious Zionist movement was way more liberal than the religious Zionism of today, which really started to shift after the Six-Day War. Certainly, there are obvious parallels between the Jewish extremism then and the increasingly violent, and I have to say scary Jewish extremism of now. But that's not so much the result of a continuous political tradition as it is the result of similarities in the demographic and political environment. And that's the recap video. Stay tuned as we enter the 20th century. And as always, special thanks to my patrons, including Matthew Von Abo, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Jacob Korsoff, Eric Liederman, and Chris Nelson.